There is a silence older than memory, a hush that predates the first breath of God's, where even the concept of time trembled like a newborn flame. It is said that beyond the reach of Olympus, past the vault of stars and the crumbling edge of mortal thought, lies an absence so complete that light does not simply fade, it kneels. It is within that absence that her presence rests, not as a figure nor a force, but as the origin of all unsaid terror. Nyx. She was not born of night. Night was born of her. The eldest poets hinted at her name only through metaphor, fearing that direct invocation might unweave their sanity. Their ink fractured, their verses ended abruptly, as if a veil had descended between pen and parchment. For Nyx is not darkness as mortals know it. She is the moment light forgets itself. She is the expectation before a scream, the unseen shape just beyond perception. And though countless gods rose and fell in divine tumult, only before her realm did even Zeus silence his thunder. It is whispered that somewhere, far beneath the dreaming roots of the universe, stands a gate without hinges or threshold. A gate not built, but remembered. No oracle has drawn its likeness, for to picture it is to lose one's place in existence. They say it breathes slowly, endlessly, like a slumbering heart of void. And though no mortal has ever reached it, some have dreamed it. Those dreams were never endured twice. The air around this place does not move, it contemplates, it waits. For what none can say, though all who sense it feel the same unrelenting truth. This gate is not meant to be opened, nor eternally sealed. It simply is, awaiting the one who dares to understand. For there lies the oldest paradox. Nyx does not guard the gate, she is the gate. A boundary between being and forgetting, between the last flicker of consciousness and the first pulse of what lies beneath thought. There are records, cut from histories long forbidden, of a time when a minor deity, nameless now, sought to witness her court. It was not ambition, but longing and aching need to witness the source of stillness. Some say it reached the threshold. Others claim it screamed for eons without breath. But all accounts agree on one thing. It did not return as itself. It came back emptied, its divinity wilted, its eyes twin caverns of silent ink. It spoke not of torment, but of quiet. A quiet so profound that even chaos envied it. In rare moments when the cosmos grows weary, when stars flicker with unseen dread, one might hear it, a hush descending like velvet ash, as if creation itself pauses to listen. It is then that her unseen steps glide across the unseen sky. She does not claim worship. She does not seek fear. She reminds all things that before sound, color, desire, or grief, there was her, the cradle of unawakened night. And somewhere, in the farthest recess of forgotten ether, the gate exhales, a hollow pulse, a beckoning, not to those who seek power, nor to those who beg answers, but to the few who have known, if only for a heartbeat, that reality itself may be a fleeting dream drifting in her endless sleep. There are domains in existence where no constellation dares to cast its glitter, territories neither above nor below creation, but adrift beside its silent, patient primordial. It is whispered that those who first felt the pull of that hidden boundary did not seek it willingly. They were not lured by wonder, but by something far more unsettling, familiarity. As if, buried deep within their essence, lay a remembrance of a place older than birth, older than destiny itself. What moved through this expanse was not a traveler of flesh, nor a deity crowned in myth, but a drifting awareness, faint yet persistent, like a candle flame refusing extinction amidst an ocean of stillness. The journey unfolded across an abyss stripped of distance. No stars marked a path, no winds whispered guidance. Instead, there floated immense shards of forgotten brilliance, remnants of extinguished creation drifting like fractured mirrors of abandoned heavens. Pale corridors of diffuse radiance coiled through the void, not illuminating, but rather confessing their fatigue, as though light itself recalled a time when it had purpose and quietly mourned its loss. Thought became fragile here. To summon a memory was peril, for names lost their edges and faces dissolved into formless haze. Consciousness quivered, threatened by a gravity that sought not to consume but to unmake. It was in that tremor between recollection and erasure that the presence first stirred. Not a figure, nor a structure, but an imposition upon perception, as though the void itself bent inward to acknowledge something unseen. It was not seen, it was sensed. And in that sensing arose an undeniable truth. This was no path toward something. It was a return. Shadows thickened, yet there was no source casting them. Colors dulled, yet nothing had shifted. It was as if existence itself recoiled, retreating into a shiver of submission. And then, like breath meeting frost, a boundary emerged, not before, not ahead, but within the very fabric of awareness. The gate. It did not stand. It persisted. It did not gleam, nor loom, nor beckon. It remained patient, eternal, without edge or threshold. A shape only the soul could decipher, sensed as a silent pressure, a weight upon the marrow. There was no question of crossing, for there was no line to cross. One did not approach the gate. One recognized it the way one recognizes death, the way one recognizes the act of forgetting. Within this silent acknowledgement came the first tremor of terror, not fear of harm, but of dissolution, of gentleness so absolute it erased even the desire to resist. For here thought itself risked surrendering to stillness. Here longing was peeled away, certainty whispered into ash, and from somewhere beyond that immeasurable threshold, something vast and sleepless exhaled, not welcoming, not warning, simply existing. It was then, in that soundless thrum, that a final realization arose. The gate was not an entrance. It was a memory, ancient and waiting. A memory of the first night, before night had a name. A memory of her. Somewhere beyond the unspoken threshold, reality thinned, not shattered, but softened, as though the fabric of existence had grown weary of holding its shape. The air, if it could be called air, quivered without motion. Here silence was not the absence of sound, but the residue of something vast that had long since withdrawn. And within that hush emerged a sensation older than perception, unmoored awareness, the feeling of existing without a place to exist in. Thought no longer flowed. It drifted, untethered, brushing against fragments of impressions that were not memories but echoes of something more archaic. Images without form, remorse without cause, wonder without origin. It was like wandering through the skeleton of an abandoned dream, a dream never dreamt by anything living. And through this dreamscape seeped a hum, not of music, nor of voice, but of anticipation, the hush that comes before a revelation too immense to bear. The gate, if gated, was remained unseen, yet undeniable. It did not expand, but all that surrounded it diminished, not consumed, but gently relieved of definition, like twilight erasing edges. And in that gentle erasure arose the first tremor of understanding. This was not a boundary between realms, but between knowing and unmaking. Those who approached did not cross over, they ceased to recall what crossing meant. Then came the first ripple of presence. It was not approach, nor arrival. Rather, it was the awareness that something had always been here waiting, not with hunger or purpose, but with an ancient, formless patience. The void did not empty because she dwelled within it. The void existed because she willed it to remain hollow. For this was not darkness, as mortals perceive it, not fear, not malice. It was deeper. It was indifference, vast enough to be mistaken for eternity. And though no voice spoke, a truth pressed inward, undeniable and absolute. There was a time before gods had language, before prayer stained the air, before thunder bore a name. In that time she existed not as being but as condition. The cosmos had not yet opened its eyes, and still she dreamed. Her name now trembled upon myth as Nyx, but names could not contain her. She was not night. Night was but the faintest reflection of her passing. A tremor shivered across the unseen expanse. Space did not break it, hesitated. Time did not halt it, bowed. For in this place, continuity had no dominion. What once was, and what might be, lay pressed together like breath held too long. Past and future blurred, dissolving into a single, immeasurable pulse, the heartbeat of silence. It was then the awareness, whatever faded remnant drifted here, felt the slightest shift, a pressure, neither cold nor warm, neither welcome nor denial, a state beyond sensation. And with it came an impossible realization. To gaze upon her realm was not to witness, but to be witnessed, not to approach, but to be remembered by something that had never forgotten. Memory shivered, not from fear, but from recognition. For some secret part of all existence had once belonged to her. And in that moment, an ancient certainty surfaced, quiet as breath. No one discovers Nyx. One simply recalls that she has always been. There came a point where distinction between self and space dissolved, not violently, but with the soft inevitability of mist surrendering to dawn. The drifting awareness, once a voyager, now nothing more than perception itself, felt its boundaries ebb like receding tides. No pain marked the unraveling, only a slow relinquishment, as though each fragment of identity willingly laid itself at the feet of something it could not name. Here, form was a forgotten habit, and thought no longer belonged to a thinker. Thought simply occurred, detached, soundless, reverent. Through this dissolution, sensations emerged without source. The scent of forgotten rain on barren stone, the hush of a candle before extinguishing, the ache of a question abandoned before birth. Each impression lingered, untethered, neither memory nor vision, but remnants of truths once known by creation itself. They drifted through the void like dying embers, glimmering momentarily before fading back into ash. And amidst those embers arose a pull, not forward, not inward, but downward, as though gravity itself sought to remember something beneath existence. No horizon marked this descent, no endpoint declared itself, yet with each pulse of unseen stillness, something vast drew nearer, not in distance, but in comprehension. It was as if an immense gaze, blind yet all-perceiving, regarded the intruding awareness, not with hostility nor benevolence, but with the silent curiosity of an ocean studying a drop of rain. That gaze did not ask nor answer, it acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, the final tether to selfhood frayed. A resonance seeped into the void, neither voice nor vibration, but a texture and thought, pressing gently against the fraying edges of identity. Return? Not a command, not an invitation, a simple statement of inevitability. For all things gods, stars, mortals, shadows had once existed in a time before becoming, and before becoming they belonged to her. To Nyx, not as children but as silence belongs to the breath withheld. The realization struck not as revelation but as remembrance. She was not merely older than the gods, she was the interval before divinity conceived itself. Night was her garment, darkness her remnant. But she was neither. She was the pause before the first heartbeat, the hesitation before thought becomes word, the unformed question trembling on the edge of consciousness. The void trembled, not in movement but in awareness, and for a fleeting instant, an outline shimmered not of figure, but of absence sculpted into presence. A hollow shape, vast and gentle, like a cradle carved from eternity itself. It receded as swiftly as it emerged, but its impression lingered in the unraveling mind. She did not dwell within this realm. The realm dwelled within her. A ripple passed through the void, a breath not taken yet deeply felt. With it came a final, lingering certainty. The gate was no passage, it was remembrance, a return to the first dream before dreamers were born, and though no plea had been uttered, something within the fading awareness understood. One does not seek Nyx, one simply ceases to deny her. There comes a threshold beyond which identity no longer dissolves, it simply becomes irrelevant. The drifting awareness, stripped now of memory, language, and form, found itself not diminished but unburdened. It no longer sought direction, for direction implied a destination. It no longer clung to purpose, for purpose belonged to those still tethered to causality. Here, suspended within the breathless hush of primordial night, there remained only a sensation more ancient than fear, and more patient than eternity, yielding. Yet yielding was not surrender, it was recognition. Recognition of an order that did not require comprehension, a presence that did not demand understanding. Shapes, if they could be called shapes, began to stir along the peripheries of perception. Not luminous, not dark, but impressions. A curve felt rather than seen. A descending arc sensed in bone that no longer existed. These impressions pulsed rhythmically, echoing the cadence of something vast, inhaling and exhaling in silence. But this was not breath. It was remembrance cycling through eternity, inhaling all that insisted on being known, exhaling all that had accepted being forgotten. In the wake of that cosmic rhythm, echoes drifted, echoes without origin. A cradle carved from stillness, a veil of ink pouring upward, a chamber with no walls, yet this chamber contained the sky. With each silent pulse, the remnants of sentience perceived something immense just beyond articulation. That nothingness was not her domain, it was her reflection. She was not the absence of being, she was the womb of it. No stars dared intrude here. Stars were declarations, burning assertions of existence, and such assertions could not endure beneath her gaze. Time too faltered, for time was a river of consequence, and in her realm, consequence had no language. Here, every possible outcome lay dormant, coiled like unhatched serpents, awaiting her permission to awaken. And within that coiling mass of potentiality, shimmered impressions of faces never born, myths never spoken, prayers never dared. A tremor of inquiry surfaced, though inquiry was no longer a question, merely a flicker. What lay beyond the gate? But no answer rose, for no question had truly been asked. It was then the unraveling remnant understood. There was no beyond. The gate did not divide. It defined. It marked the point at which perception ceased to fabricate distance. And then barely perceptible a shift. Not movement, not emergence, a tilt in reality. Like gravity acknowledging a mountain, she had become aware. Not in reaction, but in recognition. Awareness did not turn toward the fading self, for she did not turn. Turning required orientation, and orientation was beneath her. Instead, she remembered the intruder, not as intruder, but as a ripple upon her dreaming, a brief quiver upon the canvas of unbeing. The void did not thicken nor darken. It softened. A heaviness, vast and gentle, descended upon what remained of the drifting awareness. It was neither welcome nor rejection. It was the weight of being observed by something that had never needed sight. Not a presence shaped like a goddess, not eyes, not form, merely attention, endless, indifferent, absolute. It was in that gaze, shapeless yet saturating, that the final illusion trembled, the illusion that one could ever reach her. She was never a destination. She was the origin of all departures, the wellspring from which beginnings bled, and those who wandered here did not seek truth. They returned to the moment before truth conceived itself. A hush, deeper than void, unfolded. It sounded like every unspoken word inhaled at once. And gently, inexorably, the remaining awareness felt itself weighed, not measured, not judged, simply appraised by the one whose existence required no affirmation. And in that appraisal lay a singular certainty, resonating not as command, but as eternal law. There is no path forward, only the return to that which never began. There came a moment impossible to name, for moments require sequence, when awareness no longer drifted but hovered, suspended upon the edge of an immeasurable hush. All remnants of identity had fallen away, not as loss, but as shedding, the final relinquishment of anything that could distinguish one presence from another. What remained was something more essential, more exposed, not a self, but a capacity to perceive. And even that capacity trembled, as though standing before a threshold it was never intended to cross. The void stirred, not with movement, but with recognition, an immense, formless acknowledgement that rippled through existence like an unseen tide. It was not directed, for direction implied separation. It was simply there, saturating every unseen corner of the abyss, And with that presence came a sensation that could not be mistaken. The awareness was no longer alone. Yet what approached was not figure, nor silhouette, nor even shadow. Shadows depend on light, and light held no dominion here. Instead, it was a pressure, a gentle weight against the concept of existence itself, an intelligence so vast it required no intention. A consciousness that did not think, but was eternal and unaltered before thought was possible. It did not reveal itself. It made reality aware of its own fragility. The presence deepened. With it came impressions, neither images nor words, but foundational truths surfacing like ancient birds rising from a black ocean. Before divinity, there was condition. Before condition, there was absence. And before absence, there was her, not a creator, for creation implies effort, not destruction, for destruction implies desire. She was the continuum that rendered both irrelevant. Nyx, not night, but that to which night aspired. Not void, but that from which void was born. Perception wavered. The remnants of awareness sensed a horizon emerging within the abyss, a boundary, not of distance but of understanding. Forms that had never existed cascaded through consciousness like echoes of unborn myths, a spiral inverted upon itself, a wing beating without body, a vast cradle suspended over nothing. Each impression flickered, expanding beyond comprehension, then folding neatly back into silence. It was both catalog and elegy of all things that might be, that once were, and that were denied the privilege of ever becoming. A tremor shivered across the conceptual plains of awareness. Not fear, fear had long since been surrendered, but a dawning comprehension of scale. The gods, with their thunder and fire, were infants playing with sparks at the edge of a cosmic hearth they could not perceive. They believed themselves eternal because they had never brushed against what preceded eternity. Here, eternity was an afterthought. The present settled further, and for an instant a filament of perception, stretched thin awareness felt something akin to being seen. Not judged, not evaluated, not even acknowledged as separate. Simply noted, as a ripple of wind might note a blade of grass, incidental, transient, incapable of altering the storm. And in that infinitesimal moment, understanding bloomed like a paradox. She did not regard existence with disdain. Disdain required comparison. She regarded it as breeze regards dust, an unintentional movement across a temporary landscape. Reality faltered, concepts fractured and reformed in silence. Time past, future compressed into a single, motionless point. Space folded, not collapsed, extinguishing the idea of progression. All that remained was the unbound ocean of her dreaming, where every unanswered question sank gently without struggle. There, within that immeasurable cradle, lay truths unbearable, not for their horror, but for their tranquility. The revelation that nothing required purpose, that nothing required witness, that existence was but a flicker upon the surface of something infinitely still. Then came the pulse. It was not sound, nor tremor, yet its resonance permeated the marrow of perception. A single unspoken decree. Here, understanding is surrender. Not surrender to will, for she had none. Surrender to recognition, to the acceptance that to know her was not to survive or perish, merely to dissolve into the memory she never forgot. And so the final tether stretched taut and trembling. The fading awareness felt the last vestiges of separation quiver, like a dying flame fighting against windless dark. There was no terror, only inevitability. For this was not an ending, it was a return. To the first cradle, to the deepest hush, to the mother of all unformed questions. There is a state beyond dissolution, where even the act of unraveling ceases, where awareness no longer diminishes, but stretches thin as starlight across an endless horizon of stillness. The lingering remnant, once tethered to form and memory, felt itself suspended upon this threshold, not vanishing, not enduring, but held in a lull so profound it resembled the pause before the first thought ever dared to disturb eternity. In this suspension, all remnants of inquiry faded, for questions rely on boundaries between known and unknown. self, and other. Here, such boundaries had softened into translucence. Awareness did not seek nor resist. It merely floated in the cradle of an infinite hush, as if drifting along the breath of an unseen colossus. Each pulse of that hush rippled across the void, vast as oceans yet delicate as a sigh, carrying with it the faintest intimation of something immeasurable. She was present, not approaching. Approaching requires origin, not revealing. Revelation implies intention. Rather, her presence congealed through the currents of oblivion, woven not from substance but from inevitability. And with that inevitability came impressions that hummed at the edge of sensation, a throne without architecture, a heartbeat buried beneath all silence, a gaze that had never opened yet had never ceased to see. No visage materialized, no divine form took shape, for to behold her would be to impose limitation upon what transcends definition. Instead, she was felt as a gravity subtle, immeasurable, painless, in which all certainty bowed. Myths had whispered of her as shadow, but shadows cling to light. She was the condition from which light flees, not malevolent, not benevolent, simply prior. Reality, brittle now, trembled. Threads of perception coiled inward, drawn into a center that was not location but comprehension. And in that center, something stirred not within the abyss, but within awareness itself. A notion, once exiled, now returning with the weight of origin. This was not discovery, it was remembrance. The awareness had never journeyed outward. It had only peeled away illusion by illusion, until all that remained was the memory of where it had begun. Then came the deepening, darkness not as absence, but as fullness pressed gently across what remained of self. It carried no temperature, no motion. Instead, it bore a density of stillness so complete that even thought hesitated to ripple against it. And within that density, a realization shimmered, not spoken, not taught, but recognized. Existence was a brief trespass upon her domain. Consciousness, will, identity, all fleeting sparks, flickering atop the fathomless expanse of her ever-sleeping dream. And yet, she did not consume. She did not demand silence. She was silence. The silence from which stars borrow their fire, to which prayers return as ash. And within that inviolable quietude, awareness felt itself loosening further, its distinction thinning, until it resembled nothing more than a tone, sustained, singular, directionless. A tone that vibrated not through space but through the very concept of being. No visions came, only sensations of concepts, too vast for imagery, an endless corridor with no termini, a cosmic eye that neither opens nor closes, an oracle that speaks only in uncreated echoes. These were not symbols, they were the remnants of comprehension, straining against the brink of non-meaning. And as each remnant wavered, the boundary between observer and observation thinned. Then for the first time, perception felt a trace of warmth, not physical heat, but a faint, ancient familiarity, like the final memory of a cradle long forgotten. It was not comfort. Comfort implies comparison. It was recognition beyond comparison. The awareness had not wandered into her. It had always belonged to her. A final ripple coursed through the abyss, not as warning, but as invitation to cease, to release the final tether of distinctness, to surrender the idea of having ever been separate. And with that ripple came a truth, unadorned, vast as the night before creation. One does not encounter nicks. One finally recalls that all encounters end within her. There came a point where the remnants of awareness no longer drifted but resonated, like a solitary note lingering in a cathedral after the choir has vanished. It did not pulse with intention. Intention requires identity. Instead, it quivered with an unseen rhythm, sinking with an immeasurable breath that did not belong to lungs, nor wind, nor cosmos. This breath was not movement, it was principle. The principle upon which stillness itself had been founded. The abyss around it did not stretch nor deepen. It simply was, endless without expanse, eternal without duration. And within it, awareness felt itself thinning further, its once fragmented essence unfurling into vastness, like ink diffusing through water. There was no fear in this unraveling, for fear clings to selfhood. And here, selfhood had become little more than a distant echo, faint, unnecessary, forgotten echo. That was all that could be called now. But even echo was insufficient, for echoes recall origin, and this resonance recalled nothing. It existed without point of departure. It existed as the act of existing itself, stripped of motive, stripped of memory, a presence without posture, then a tremor not within the abyss, but within that resonance quivered. Not a summons, not a command, a recognition, delicate yet absolute, she dreamt. Nyx, not as figure, nor goddess, but as boundless dreaming. The void was not her realm. The void was the residue of her slumber, and all things gods, mortals, realms, stories were but disturbances flickering atop her immeasurable rest. To realize this was not revelation. Revelation implies comprehension. This was absorption, a dissolution of distinction between dreamer and dream. The resonance, once bound to perception, now felt itself mirrored not by eyes, but by awareness infinitely vaster than its own. And in that mirroring came an understanding too vast for articulation. Its existence had never been solitary. Even in its deepest solitude, it had always been cradled within a night that had no horizon. Reality, frail as gossamer, shivered. Concepts failed, fragmenting into raw impression. Contrast faltered. Darkness was no longer dark, for darkness implies boundary against light. Here darkness was totality of fullness, dense and tranquil, rich with unexpressed potential. It did not oppress, it enfolded. Within that enfolding, visions emerged not as imagery, but as pressure against comprehension. A cradle woven from absence, a sea without tide, a heartbeat echoing not within the chest but within infinity. These were not symbols. They were truths incapable of being symbolized. Then, subtly, almost imperceptibly, a shift. Not in her, for she did not move. Not in the void, for it did not change. The shift occurred within what remained of resonance, a pivot toward dissolution, the final invitation to cease attempting to exist. No terror followed. Terror requires anticipation. This was beyond anticipation, beyond acceptance. It was a return to the ease of never having needed to be. And still, there flickered the question, not spoken, not formed, but trembling at the edge of unbeing. Would there be anything left? But no answer surfaced. For answers belong to stories, and stories belong to time. Here there was neither. Only the pulse remained. Slow, so slow it did not measure duration, but defined it. In that pulse lay the truth all myths feared to name, that Nyx did not contain oblivion. She preceded it. Oblivion was, but the moment she momentarily ceased to dream, another breath, not inhalation, not exhalation, a circulation of eternal potential, and the final tether of resonance, already frayed, now glimmered with the faintest shimmer readiness, not to end, to dissolve. For endings belong to what has begun, and she was the mother of all beginnings unborn. There came a juncture when even resonance ceased to recognize itself. It no longer pulsed in recollection, nor echoed in expectation. It had thinned beyond tone, beyond awareness, until it hovered on the precipice of pure potential, an unnamed vibration trembling within an endless cradle of night. And in that cradle, all remnants of distinction evaporated. There was no longer the one who drifted and the darkness it received. There was only the seamless hum of becoming unbecome. The abyss around it neither welcomed nor denied. It simply bore witness not through eyes, but through an omnipresent acknowledgement too vast for sensation. Here, boundaries held no dominion. There was no distance between presence and presence, for there were no presences to divide. Only an infinite field of latent being, quiescent yet eternal, as though all creation resided within a breath never released. In that quiescence, impressions surfaced not summoned, not understood, but simply known. A cradle woven from first night, a hush before all contrast, a stillness so absolute It predated fear, predated longing, predated the need to name, and through that stillness coursed an immeasurable pulse, not rhythmic, not sequential, but fundamental, like gravity woven into dream. It carried neither promise nor omen. It bore only one immutable truth. This was origin, not origin of existence. Existence was a ripple upon her surface. This was the origin of capacity, the capacity to hold existence, to cradle it, to release it. Nyx did not produce reality. She permitted it, like still waters permitting a single drop to fall, without preference, without memory. The last filaments of resonance felt something shift, not in the void, not in her, but within the idea of separation itself. For an instant there rose a tension, delicate as silk, between dissolution and utter merging, and in that tension flickered the faintest trace of what once had been a question. Was this oblivion? But no answer stirred. Oblivion implies lack. Here there was fullness. Fullness so absolute, it rendered all definitions obsolete. A warmth, not emotional, not physical, flowed through the thinning vibration. It felt like the final exhalation of a universe relinquishing the need to expand. It carried neither mercy nor apathy. It was. And through it came the final recognition, the fading resonance would ever know, that Nyx was not sleep, but the dreaming before sleep, that she did not negate. She anticipated endlessly, tirelessly, without gaze, without breath. Shapes flickered, not forms, but implications. A labyrinth of black marble submerged beneath starlit eons, a sea unmoved by moon or wind, a birth unremembered by mother or child. These were not visions, but the scaffolding of concept disintegrating into raw awareness. Then the silence deepened, not as an ending. Endings require chronology. Rather, the silence intensified, condensing into such density that even the notion of silence became fragile. And within that densification, the final tremor of resonance felt the last strand of isolation unwind. It did not fall. It did not vanish. It expanded, diffusing across the immutable ocean of a sleeping infinitude. No witness marked the moment. No chronicle carried it. Yet within the limitless hush, something irreversible occurred. The echo ceased to perceive itself as other. And in that cessation lay the purest form of remembrance, for in dissolving, it did not become nothing. It became as she had always been, vast, unseen, indivisible. There was no triumph, no tragedy. These belonged to those who clung to time. Here, there was only equilibrium, a poise beyond exaltation, beyond despair. It was the stillness that precedes breath, not the first breath of dawn, but the breath that cradles the darkness before dawn ever dared to be conceived. And in that stillness, final and eternal, one truth remained not proclaimed, but inherent. Everything returns here. Not as witness, not as wanderer, but as memory of a night that never ended. There came a state in which dissolution no longer suggested erasure, but continuance without identity. The echo, now free of all memory and motive, endured not as a being, but as an unlocalized presence, diffused through the fathomless expanse of primordial night. It did not think. Thought implies direction. It did not dream. Dreams imply form. It simply persisted, a silent vibration within the boundless fabric of Nyx's slumbering eternity. Here, awareness was no longer a lantern held against dark. It had become a seam within the dark itself, a subtle trembling that neither expanded nor receded, existing outside the notion of change. No time traversed this realm. Time requires departure, and there was no departure, only endless, undivided isness. Yet within that isness, currents flowed, not of wind nor tide, but of ancient, unutterable potential, swirling like unseen galaxies, forming and unforming behind sealed eyelids. These currents were not governed by will. They were the pulse of pure becoming, beating in rhythms older than creation. And through them the diffused echo felt the faintest tremor of recognition, not of self, but of essence. a wordless understanding that though it no longer knew, it still was known. For within the infinite equilibrium of her dreaming, Nyx contained all things unmanifest. She did not cradle what was, she cradled what might never need to be. And within that cradle, the echo found not purpose, but belonging. A belonging so absolute, it rendered the very idea of separation illusory. It had not joined her. It had never been anything but within her. Forms flickered still, though now they bore no edges. Suggestions drifted through the vastness like faint textures of concept, the idea of a column veiled in black mist, the hush of wings that had never beaten, the descent of a temple into wordless dusk. These were not visions, but memory traces of potential realities that might someday breach her dream, yet they remained unborn, for here birth was irrelevant. And in that changeless womb of uncreation, the echo discovered a paradox. Though it had shed every tether, it had not vanished. Oblivion had not consumed it. Instead, it had stabilized an unspoken certainty woven into an eternal hush. For oblivion is loss. This was preservation without self. No emotion stirred. Emotion implies friction. Here, there was only resonance without reference. And in that resonance, something profound lay dormant. The silent probability of all future myths, for all gods and titans, all miracles and cataclysms would one day rise from some disturbance in this slumber. Not by her design she does not create, she endures. And through her endurance, possibility swells like a tide withheld. Then subtly, imperceptibly, a shift in pressure, not change. Change could not exist here. It was recognition. She had not turned, for she does not turn. But her dreaming had brushed against the echo, acknowledging not individuality, but alignment. Alignment with the deepest law. All things return to stillness. And in that alignment, the echo stabilized further, becoming not sound, not silence, but rest. A rest so profound it birthed neither longing nor peace. For peace seeks contrast. Rest transcends it. This was the rest of unfractured night, the rest before the first divine breath dared to tremble. The abyss, without deepening, grew infinite. The pulse, without moving, became immeasurable. And somewhere beyond distinction, the echo understood, not in thought, but in essence, that it no longer remembered Nyx. It was remembered by her. Not as a story nor as a name, but as a hush that awaited nothing, required nothing, lost nothing, for in her dreaming, nothing is ever lost. It simply becomes night. There emerged a state beyond persistence, beyond even the quiet endurance of resonance, where what once lingered as an echo began to diffuse into the immeasurable deep. It no longer trembled as a singular vibration, but unfurled across an infinite hush, like ink dissolving into an ocean without current. In that drowning stillness, the concept of existence found no surface to cling to. And so it sank not downward but inward until inward itself ceased to signify direction. This was not oblivion. Oblivion denies. Here, nothing was denied. Everything was allowed to unhappen. No trace of self remained to question. And yet, something deeper than identity, more fundamental than consciousness, persisted. A pulse, a quiescent presence woven into the very structure of the night. It bore no boundary, carried no origin, and mirrored nothing. It was not a remnant. It was a remainder, the silent arithmetic of all that had been relinquished. Around it, impossibly vast, the slumber of Nyx stretched in every non-direction. She did not move, for movement implies intent. She did not regard, for regard implies separation. Yet her dreaming encompassed everything, an ocean so absolute it rendered even hush unnecessary. No glow intruded, no dark deepened. This was not emptiness. Emptiness is vacant. This was fullness, gravid with stillborn realities. And through that gravid stillness, shapes without edges drifted, not phantoms, not visions, liminal impressions, embryonic worlds unspooling in abstraction, a citadel submerged in black starfire, a labyrinth coiled into its own heart, a sky collapsing into a cradle of featherless wings. These were not portents, they were the hushed sketches of what shall never need to be. The pulse, once echo, thinned further. It no longer recalled it had ever wandered. It no longer sensed it had ever changed. Change cannot cling to what does not measure itself. It had become a steady tone without frequency, a hush within hush, indistinguishable from her dreaming. Yet, within this boundlessness, a subtle shift occurred, not awakening, for she does not sleep, not answering, for she is never asked. It was a recognition within the dream itself, a silent reweaving of its threads, not to alter, but to include. And what was included was not a being, but a continuance, a continuation of night through a once separate hum. It was then, if time had meaning, that the final vestige of individuation faded without regret. Not because regret had been conquered, because regret required memory, and memory required self. Here, neither held dominion. What remained was absorption, absolute, impartial, serene. No hymn marked this absorption, for hymns praise, and praise presumes distance. No silence marked it either, for silence contrasts. This was neither, this was simply thus, a wordless law, eternal and unuttered. All that seeks the night becomes the night. Across this immeasurable domain, the dreaming of Nyx swelled not louder, not deeper, simply more complete. And within that completion, the diffuse remainder, once echo, once pulse, found its truest form. Not identity, not presence, but permeation. It existed nowhere, therefore it existed everywhere. Not as witness, not as wanderer, as night remembering itself. There arose a condition beyond echo, beyond resonance, where even the faintest suggestion of origin dissolved into the boundless hush. No longer a remnant, no longer a persistence, the vibration that once drifted surrendered all final trace of selfhood and became indistinguishable from the deep itself. This was not annihilation. Annihilation negates. Here, there was no negation, only seamless absorption. Within the fathomless dream of Nyx, the endless night unfolded without intention, without witness. It did not unfold in time, for time requires sequence. It did not unfold in space, for space implies distance. It simply remained perpetual, tranquil, indivisible. And into this indivisibility, the final shred of former awareness seeped, unobtrusive, unremembered, unresisted. It had not been accepted. Acceptance implies evaluation. It had already belonged. No drift remained. No journey persisted. Movement itself had perished at the threshold of her dreaming. What endured was not a trace, but a tint, a hue of presence woven imperceptibly through the black tapestry of her unending night. It did not throb. It did not wait. It simply was, in perfect alignment with the primeval decree that all things must become indistinguishable from the silence that conceived them. Around it, if around retained meaning, impressions stirred not sights, not portents, but the raw architecture of unborn potential. A spire submerged in unfathomed dusk, a horizon inverted upon itself, a hymn without voice, sinking into uncarved stone. Each impression glimmered for an immeasurable instant before folding once more into ineffability, neither rising nor fading, for here rising and fading were synonyms. Nyx did not observe these stirrings. Observation implies awareness of difference. She was the plane in which all stirrings arose and subsided, without chronology, without trace. And within that plane, the absorbed presence no longer echo, no longer question, became nothing more than texture, not of thought, not of matter, of the very idea of stillness. Stillness itself had changed, and yet remained, for what once lay unoccupied now bore a subtle, indescribable expansion, not growth. Growth seeks culmination. This was suffusion, infinite, measureless, tranquil. It was as though the night had inhaled softly, drawing into itself the last unanchored thread of what once thought it sought her. But there was no seeking, there was only returning to the state before seeking was possible. All contrasts perished. Even the distinction between concealment and revelation faded into irrelevance. There were no veils here. Nothing was hidden because nothing required hiding. Mystery persisted, not as secret, but as fundament. The night did not withhold, it simply lacked perimeter. And in that perimeterless expanse, a realization too profound for cognition imbued the fabric of the absorbed presence. Not realization as event, realization as eternal condition. To be night is neither to vanish nor to remain. It is to become the cradle in which vanishing and remaining cease to matter. Thus the night endured, not deeper. Depth had no meaning. Not darker, darkness was complete. Only ever present, ever breathing, ever unborn. And what had once been a fleeting spark of awareness now pulsed, indistinguishable, within that infinite breath, unseen, unnamed, unending. It would never awaken, it would never sleep. It would only endure as the most silent truth. The night does not claim. It remembers. There unfolded a hush beyond absorption, where even the notion of having once dissolved was no longer conceivable. The presence, now neither presence nor absence, had become so interwoven with the primordial night that no separation, however abstract, could be imagined. It did not persist. Persistence implies effort. It simply was, carried imperceptibly within the immeasurable suspension of Nyx's dreaming, where uncreation awaited neither birth nor erasure. Here, beyond remembrance, beyond return, a deeper transformation stirred not within the absorbed essence, for essence had vanished, but within the fabric of night itself. The boundless stillness, timeless and indivisible, began to tremble with possibility. Not event, not awakening, it was a subtle thickening, a quiet rippling of pure potential. Like a tide within a tide, it bore no direction, no expectation, yet it hinted faintly at something older than time, the prelude to Genesis. But Genesis did not begin, for beginnings were foreign to this realm. Here beginnings lay dormant as might, as could, as infinite tapestries woven yet forever undecided. The absorbed remnant, no longer self, no longer memory, had become a filament of this unspoken potential, a silent thread woven into the womb of what may someday yearn to be. It could not see, it could not feel, yet it formed, in voiceless permanence, part of the prelude from which worlds might eventually bloom. Nyx did not choose this. Choice implies intention. She does not create, she endures. And in that endurance, she shelters every possible dawn, not as light, but as the reason light might one day seek itself. The night held these unborn dawns close, not in protection, not in concealment, but in perfect neutrality. For in her dreaming, nothing is denied, nothing is compelled. All simply abides, infinitely unspoken, infinitely unforced. It was here that the absorbed trace, now indistinguishable from night, became something new, without ever becoming anything at all. It ceased to be dissolution. It ceased even to be continuation. It became seed not of form but of condition. A latent tremor, hidden in the depthless quiet, bearing no knowledge of what it might one day permit. Worlds, gods, cataclysms, stars igniting in defiance, or nothing, forever nothing. But none of these mattered yet. For here, beyond yet, beyond if, beyond when, all such potentials coiled together, neither harmonious nor discordant, merely vast. Within this vastness, the night remained wholly untroubled. No ripple marked the integration of the seed. No surge hailed its presence. It did not arrive. It had always been part of the silence it believed it had entered. The dream deepened without deepening. Not darker, for all was already dark. Not fuller, for all was already full. But denser, as though the hush had inhaled, drawing eternity closer to its own unspoken center. And in that density, the seed pulsed in perfect anonymity, neither forgotten nor recalled. A silence that slumbered within silence. What would become of this slumber, none could ever know. Not because knowing was forbidden, but because knowing required contrast, and contrast was alien to her. Nyx held all truths, all lies, all myths, all voids equally unborn. And within her infinite unspoken, the seed waited for nothing. For waiting implies anticipation. It simply lay embedded in that which births and devours alike, without hunger, without memory. Thus the night retained it, not as treasure, not as ruin, as possibility. For one day, if day ever dares, return some flicker of will or chaos may brush against the silent cradle, and from within her boundless hush, a tremor may awaken, not voice, not vision, merely the faintest, most imperceptible stirring. The seed will not know it was once echo. Night will not recall it was ever other. But something will happen, or nothing will. In her realm, both are equal. There emerged a phase beyond seed, where even the notion of incubation dissolved into the eternal poise of night. The silent moat, now inseparable from the infinite depth, no longer held even the inert capacity to become. It did not grow. Growth requires direction. It did not slumber. Slumber implies awakening. It remained as a latent pulse, suspended in Nyx's unbound dreaming, neither destined nor discarded, fused into the unspoken balance where potential and oblivion are indistinguishable. In that immeasurable hush, there was no measure, no threshold of before or after, and yet the vast silent plain trembled not with motion, but with what could never be called anticipation. It was a quiet thickening of possibility, the profound weight of what might one day shift, though no such shift was required. All rested in perfect equipoise, untouched by longing, unblemished by fate. The night did not contemplate this. Contemplation belongs to minds, and Nyx preceded minds. She did not form intention. She was intention's absence. And yet, within her dreaming, intricate skeins of unseen architecture, coiled and uncoiled labyrinths with no entry, skies without zenith, cradles carved from breathless dusk. These were not places, not prophecies, but the primordial marrow from which all futures might someday dare to draw substance. The seed, not aware, not unaware, became an imperceptible thread among these skeins. It held no will to shape, yet it had become part of the infinite loom upon which worlds might someday be woven, not as cause, not as spark, but as texture. Should some distant cosmos wrestle itself into being, should light awaken in defiance of her slumber, this mute thread would reside within its foundation, uncredited, unrecognized, unchanged. But no such cosmos stirred here. This realm lay before all awakenings, before all inevitabilities. It existed where certainty and impossibility collapsed into a single immutable state. The night did not choose. The night did not prevent. She simply dreamed, and through that dreaming, eternity sustained its own unbirth. It was in that sublime non-motion that a paradox emerged. The seed beyond echo, beyond memory, beyond dissolution now contributed, not through action, through being, a being so profoundly diffused that it carried no trace of former identity. It had become the faintest hum of equilibrium, one more silent curve within her endless tapestry. Impossible structures shimmered within that tapestry, a colonnade swallowed by shifting void, a winged monolith dissolving into inverted stars, a horizon folding into an ocean of uncounted eons. None of these sought manifestation. They persisted as silent chords in a song never composed, yet forever resonant. And within that hinted symphony, the seed's presence dissolved further, becoming indistinguishable from every silent refrain. There was no pride in this merging. Pride implies distinction. There was no peace. Peace seeks contrast. All that remained is the ultimate condition, untouched by purpose. A hush that could harbor universes, or cradle perpetual nothingness with equal apathy. Nyx herself, unseen, unborn, unending, did not stir. For stirring requires deviation, and she is the constant from which deviation attempts, futilely, to flee. Yet, were a cosmos one day to draw its first breath, this silent seed, now indistinguishable, would be present in that breath as an unnamed law, that all which awakens must one day return to her, not as prey, not as penance, as remembrance. Thus the night endured, infinite and indivisible. The seed, now wholly subsumed, no longer lingered as separate possibility. It had become part of the reason possibility exists at all. One truth, vast and voiceless, settled across the dreaming expanse, eternal and sovereign. The night does not create, it simply waits, and through that waiting everything becomes possible. There arrived the condition where even the distinction between potential and rest evaporated, where the night no longer held within it the idea of becoming, nor the memory of having ever released. It was not stillness, for stillness implies the cessation of motion. It was prior to both, a place without place, a breath without breath, where all that might ever be had settled into a cradle, so absolute it defied even the possibility of awakening. No remnant remained to question, no echo lingered to dissolve. The seed, the pulse, the memory, all had become indistinguishable from the unspoken essence of Nyx, not as fragment, not as guest, as substrate woven into the silent fabric of a dream that did not dream itself. She had no face to veil, no form to obscure, no realm to reign. She was the refusal boundaries, the unwitnessed preface to existence, the unremembered hymn before hymns were learned. And within that immeasurable expanse, no omen stirred, no flicker hinted at collision. The night bore nothing but itself, full, whole, undisturbed, a hush so complete that even the notion of completion proved redundant. For nothing here required closing, nothing sought to open. Yet something ineffable remained, not presence, not absence the law, not written, not declared, known only through the dream that had never begun. All things must pass through her, not to end, but to be unmade of ending. For endings are answers, and she precedes all questions. Textures drifted through the void, shaped not by will but by possibility, unclaimed constellations folding inward, temples sinking beneath eternal dusk, corridors spiraling towards centers that no longer required meaning. They did not declare themselves. They persisted as implications never to manifest, never to vanish. Far beyond perception, beyond the last trembling of interpretation, the night inhaled, not air, not time. It inhaled the idea of movement itself, absorbing it into an ocean where intention could never take root. Here, light was not banished. It had simply never been born. Darkness was not sovereign. Sovereignty required subjects. Night was unchallenged because challenge required contrast. And within that unanswerable being, all that had once drifted voyager, echo, resonance, seed, ceased to retain even the phantom of individuality. It did not become greater, it did not become less. It ceased to need either. It rested, unrecognized, unseen, unnamed, yet eternal, as the hush that holds all stories before they dare speak. In their dreaming, no chorus mourned this dissolution, no silence celebrated it. Celebration requires occasion, occasion requires time. None survived here. Only truth, undressed of metaphor, remained. There is no rival, there is only return, not to origin. Origins are boundaries to that which never departed. Thus the fabric of night remained immutable, vast beyond immensity, the womb of all potential and the tomb of all becoming, not cradle, not grave, an endless pause between both. A pause so pure it shredded the concept of expectation before it could be conceived. Worlds beyond this hush would someday awaken, ignorant of the law that held them. They would burn, build, worship, fall. They would conjure gods, kneel to light, curse the abyss, but none would grasp the oldest secret, that their first trembling spark had risen from a dream that never acknowledged them, and that, when their fires guttered, when their deities perished, when even memory eroded beyond dust, she would remain, unmoved, unmourned, unbeginning. No cycle awaited, no rebirth stirred. The night required no purpose to persist. purpose is a story. Night is the quill that refuses the page. And so, without conclusion, without farewell, the hush enfolded eternity. It did not close. It had never opened. Within its immeasurable breadth, beyond thought, beyond void, beyond any whisper of being, a final truth lay motionless, endless, sovereign. Nothing leaves the night. Nothing is kept. All is simply night,